Every global financial system collapses the same way. Not from invasion, not from sabotage, from internal math that eventually stops working. History records this pattern clearly, and it never ends differently. It happened to Rome, it happened to Spain, it happened to the British Empire. And now, every structural warning sign that preceded those collapses is present in the system that dominates the world today. The US dollar is not just a currency. It is the foundation of global trade, global debt, and global reserves. Oil is priced in it. Debt is settled in it. Nations depend on access to it to function. That dominance creates enormous power and enormous fragility. And right now, the conditions that ended every previous financial empire are aligned. Exploding debt, chronic deficits, currency expansion used to cover structural imbalance, declining trust masked by temporary stability. The system still functions, but only by pushing its limits further each year. This is the dangerous phase. History shows that financial systems don't collapse when people panic. They collapse when confidence quietly erodes while the surface still looks normal. Markets still open, payments still clear, governments still reassure, and behind the scenes the math gets worse. We are not approaching this pattern. We are inside it. Every previous reserve currency followed the same trajectory. First comes dominance, then excess, then leverage, then dilution. And once trust breaks, the decline accelerates fast. What takes decades to build can unravel in years. This is not a prediction. It's a sequence. And the mistake every empire makes is believing its system is different, right up until it isn't. The dollar has not collapsed, but the stage it's in tells you exactly what comes next. The only uncertainty left is how quickly the next phases arrive. Most people believe issuing the world's reserve currency is a sign of strength. In reality, it's a trap. Reserve status doesn't reward discipline. It punishes it. When a currency becomes global, demand no longer depends on what the country produces. The world needs the currency to trade, to borrow, to settle debt, to store reserves. That demand forces the issuing country to supply liquidity at scale, year after year, cycle after cycle, and there's only one way to do that: permanent deficits. To feed global demand, the reserve issuer must export its currency instead of goods. Consumption replaces production. Debt replaces savings. Finance expands while industry shrinks. This isn't mismanagement, it's structural mathematics. Every reserve currency faced this same dilemma. To stay dominant, it had to flood the world with money. To flood the world, it had to weaken its own balance sheet. The mechanism that creates power also guarantees decay. The numbers make this unavoidable. Global trade requires trillions in liquidity. That liquidity can only come from deficits. And once deficits become structural, they cannot be reversed without collapsing the system that depends on them. That's the trap. The issuing country cannot tighten without breaking global trade. It cannot cut spending without triggering recession. It cannot raise rates without detonating debt. Every option makes something worse. So it delays, it borrows, it expands credit, it reassures. This is why reserve currencies don't fail from panic. They fail from denial. Confidence erodes quietly while the surface still looks normal. Markets still function. Payments still clear. Headlines still say resilient. But underneath, dilution compounds and trust thins. Reserve status doesn't protect a currency. It locks it into a sequence with no clean exit. And history shows that once a system reaches this stage, the timeline doesn't stretch. It compresses. Every dominant currency begins the same way, by solving other people's problems. At first, adoption is voluntary. Traders need a common unit. Banks need a deep settlement layer. Governments need a currency liquid enough to handle global flows. The issuing power provides it, and the world adopts it because it works better than the alternatives. This stage feels neutral, even beneficial. As adoption spreads, contracts shift into the dominant currency. Energy, shipping, insurance, and sovereign debt are priced in it. Central banks accumulate it as reserves. Within a generation, more than half of global trade and the majority of cross-border finance move through a single monetary system. That's when usefulness turns into dependence. Once trade, debt, and reserves are locked into one currency, exiting stops being a choice. Switching settlement systems raises costs. Pricing outside the system reduces liquidity. Rejecting the currency isolates markets. What began as convenience hardens into obligation. Control doesn't arrive with force. It arrives through infrastructure. Clearing systems, correspondent banking, and payment rails determine who can transact efficiently and who can't. Access becomes leverage. Compliance is enforced quietly, without sanctions needing to be announced. History shows this clearly. In the 19th century, countries outside Britain's pound-based system paid more to trade and borrowed at worse terms. Participation wasn't mandatory, but exclusion was expensive enough to make it irrelevant. The same dynamic defines every dominant currency. By this stage, confidence is absolute. Growth accelerates. Capital floods in. The system is praised for stability. Few notice that sovereignty is already slipping, because once your trade, debt, and reserves depend on one currency, strength no longer protects you. Habit does, and when a system built on habit begins to strain, exit isn't gradual, it's disruptive. And that's when the real pressure starts. Once dominance is established, the system enters its most deceptive phase. This stage looks like prosperity. Capital pours in. Borrowing becomes cheap. Asset prices surge. Living standards appear strong. The issuing country is praised for its resilient economy and financial leadership. From the surface, everything looks successful. That's the trap. Because at this point, demand for the currency is no longer tied to productivity. It's driven by global dependence. Foreign governments, banks, and corporations need access to the system to function, so capital keeps flowing in, even as fundamentals deteriorate. The imbalance grows quietly. Production shrinks while consumption expands. Manufacturing loses share while finance dominates. Over time, the economy shifts from creating value to extracting it. Returns come from leverage, speculation, and asset inflation, not from output. This isn't moral failure, it's incentive math. When cheap capital is guaranteed, discipline disappears. Why invest in long-term production when financial returns arrive faster? Why rebalance when deficits are absorbed automatically by global demand? The system rewards excess and punishes restraint. History shows where this leads. During Britain's peak, London absorbed global capital while domestic industry weakened. The empire felt wealthy, but its productive base eroded beneath the surface. By the time imbalance became undeniable, correction was no longer possible without pain. This is the critical shift. At this stage, every solution creates damage. Cutting deficits triggers recession. Raising rates destabilizes debt. Rebuilding industry requires sacrifices voters won't accept. Any adjustment threatens the prosperity people believe defines success. So leaders delay. They redefine imbalance as strength. Deficits become global demand. Asset bubbles become innovation. Debt expansion becomes manageable. The system still functions, so warnings are dismissed. But imbalance doesn't disappear, it accumulates. And once a system reaches this stage, there is no painless exit. Correction stops being a choice and becomes an event. The longer it's delayed, the more violent it becomes. This is where dominance quietly turns into vulnerability, and by the time the weakness is visible, the system is already locked in. This is the stage where the system quietly loses its ability to recover. Once dominance creates abundance, incentives flip. Producing goods becomes harder, slower, and less profitable. Consuming becomes easier, cheaper, and politically popular. Capital follows that shift every time. Factories lose priority. Finance gains it. At this stage, the economy stops rewarding output and starts rewarding access. Returns come from leverage, assets, and speculation, not from building capacity. Over time, production shrinks while consumption expands, financed by debt and sustained by global demand for the currency. The numbers always tell the same story. Trade deficits become permanent. Consumption exceeds output year after year. Living standards are maintained not by productivity, but by borrowing against the system's credibility. As long as confidence holds, it feels sustainable. This is the illusion. History shows that once an economy crosses this line, reversal becomes politically impossible. Rebuilding production requires higher costs, lower consumption, and years of sacrifice. No government survives by telling voters their standard of living must fall to restore stability. So it doesn't happen. Instead, the system adapts around the weakness. Credit expands. Imports replace domestic capacity. Financial innovation fills the gap where productivity once existed. The economy still grows, but it grows hollow. This is the point of no return. When production declines, resilience disappears. Shocks can no longer be absorbed. Supply chains tighten. Dependence deepens. The system still functions, but only under perfect conditions, and perfect conditions never last. This stage doesn't cause collapse by itself. It removes the margin for error. Once consumption replaces production, growth depends entirely on debt, confidence, and continued inflows. If any one of those falters, adjustment is no longer gradual or controlled. It's sudden. This is where strength turns into fragility, and where the system loses the ability to save itself. This is the stage where the system loses its ability to choose. Once production has been replaced by consumption, debt stops being optional. It becomes structural. Borrowing is no longer used to smooth cycles or fund growth. It becomes the mechanism that keeps the entire system functioning. At this point, debt doesn't expand because of emergencies. It expands because stability now depends on it. Governments borrow to maintain living standards. Corporations borrow to sustain earnings. Households borrow to preserve purchasing power. Remove leverage from any one layer, and the weakness underneath is exposed immediately. The scale is what matters. Debt grows faster than income year after year. Deficits no longer shrink during economic expansions. Interest becomes one of the fastest growing obligations in the system. Yet collapse doesn't arrive, because the dominant currency still absorbs demand. The system appears stressed but intact. That illusion is dangerous. By this stage, every policy option causes damage. Cutting spending triggers contraction. Raising taxes slows growth. Raising rates destabilizes markets and governments simultaneously. Printing money preserves stability today, but erodes confidence tomorrow. There is no clean move left. This is the lock-in. Leaders don't deny the problem. They deny the urgency. Targets are shifted. Projections are revised. Temporary measures become permanent. Each intervention buys time by increasing dependence on debt. This is why solutions stop changing. Whenever pressure appears, the response is identical. More borrowing, more liquidity, more reassurance. The present is stabilized at the cost of the future. Exit paths narrow quietly. History shows this stage without exception. Every dominant financial system reaches a point where debt must grow just to prevent contraction. Once crossed, reversal is politically impossible and economically destabilizing. The system must keep expanding leverage to survive. From here on, outcomes are driven by momentum, not policy. And momentum only moves in two directions: faster or broken. At this stage, collapse doesn't require a shock. It only requires the system to keep going exactly as it is. This is the stage where the system quietly loses its anchor. Once debt locks the system in place, dilution stops being a choice. It becomes mandatory. Currency must expand to service obligations, stabilize markets, and prevent contraction. What began as emergency policy turns into routine survival. This is where money starts to fail at its core function. It doesn't collapse overnight. It erodes. Purchasing power slips year after year. Prices rise unevenly. Assets inflate faster than wages. Savings lose value slowly enough to be explained away, until the loss becomes undeniable. History shows this pattern clearly. Before confidence breaks, behavior changes first. People don't panic. They adapt. They spend sooner. They borrow more aggressively. They move capital faster. Holding cash feels risky. Long-term planning gives way to short-term positioning. This is the real turning point. Money stops being a store of value and becomes a tool for timing. You hold it only briefly. You exchange it quickly. Trust isn't gone, but it's conditional and temporary. Once that shift happens, the system destabilizes itself. Consumers accelerate spending to outrun dilution. Investors chase risk to preserve returns. Governments intervene more frequently to suppress volatility. Each response increases the pressure it's meant to relieve. Stability becomes brittle. This is where trust actually breaks. Not when headlines turn negative, but when enough participants reach the same quiet conclusion. Holding the currency is no longer the safest option. No announcement is needed. No crisis is required. At that point, confidence collapses asymmetrically. It leaves slowly, but it returns never. Timelines compress. What once unfolded over years happens in months. Volatility becomes constant. Planning becomes guesswork. The system still operates, but belief no longer supports it. This is the final internal stage. The structure is still standing, but the foundation is gone. And when money is no longer trusted, the rest of the system doesn't fall. It slides, all at once. Every system that fails tells the same lie at the end, that it still has time. Rome believed debasement could continue without consequence. Britain believed confidence would hold. Every dominant financial power that reached this stage convinced itself that functionality meant safety. It never did. The end is not announced. There is no headline, no reset, no clean transition. By the time money stops being trusted, choices are already gone. Governments cannot cut spending without triggering contraction. They cannot raise rates without detonating debt. They cannot restore confidence because confidence no longer responds to policy. Every move stabilizes one surface while destabilizing another. Control disappears, but responsibility remains. This is where systems fail silently. Markets still open, payments still clear, official numbers still look manageable, and underneath, behavior has already changed. People move faster, they hold less, they trust shorter. The system still exists, but belief no longer supports it. That's the point no model captures. Once trust breaks, it does not come back on command. It cannot be voted in. It cannot be regulated into existence. Trust is built slowly and lost asymmetrically, quietly at first, then everywhere at once. This is why the final phase feels chaotic. Prices swing without warning, narratives stop matching outcomes, emergency measures become permanent, stability turns performative, the system reacts, but it no longer corrects. And here is the part history is ruthless about. When a dominant financial system reaches this stage, the question is no longer whether it changes, it's who absorbs the cost of that change, because the structure does not fail evenly. It shifts pressure downward, into wages, into savings, into purchasing power, into anyone who still believes normal rules apply. The dollar has not collapsed, but the behaviors that precede collapse are already visible. And once those behaviors spread, timelines compress. What once took decades happens in years. What once took years happens suddenly. The system doesn't break, it slips. And by the time most people realize what's happening, they're no longer asking what comes next. They're asking why it feels too late to move.